Hello and welcome back to Canal Hunter. My name is Andy Tidy, and for the eagle-eyed continuity analysts among you, yes, I am standing in exactly the same space wearing the same clothes that I wore when I closed the last episode. It's true, sometimes I make more than one episode on the same day. This episode has some real significance. It's the penultimate episode in my quest to document all the lost 60 miles of the Birmingham Canal navigations. A quest which was inspired years ago by a book by a bloke called Richard Chester Brown, who kind of came the same way back in the 1970s. And Richard, if you've been watching these videos, I really hope that I've done your book justice. Now, in this episode, I want to look exclusively at the Lapal Tunnel. This tunnel was and remains the Achilles heel of this waterway. It was a really narrow gauge bore, which was 3,795 yards long. That's over 2 miles and heading out in that direction. We leave the countryside here near Halesowen, and when it re-emerges, it emerges in the urban environment of Selly Oak. The brick tunnel itself started out at 9 feet wide at the waterline, but this, because of the pressures of the surrounding land, narrowed down to about 7'9". And when you consider that a loaded boat would be about 7 feet wide and sometimes maybe 7 feet 2 when they stretched a bit, there wasn't an awful lot of space either at the sides or at the bottom for the water in front to pass and get behind. And that meant that the passage through the 2-mile tunnel for loaded boats, which was predominantly from here at the west through to the east, was an unbelievably slow and painful process. In fact, boats had to be legged through, and it appears that their normal rate of passage through the tunnel was a bare 1/2 of a mile an hour. It took them 4 hours to get from here to California. And truth be told, the tunnel height wasn't much better. A mere 6 feet from waterline to the very crown of the top of the tunnel. Again, very similar to its smaller sister tunnel at the Gosty Hill back up the canal. Now, before we go trying to trace the line of the canal over the hill, I want to take you back, figuratively, about 400 yards back down the canal. And in the last episode, I mentioned that we were passing the site of an old pumping engine. Now, normally a pumping engine on the BCN means somewhere where water is being pulled up, maybe from the bottom of locks or from the substrata to fill the canal. But that wasn't the case here at all. Now, I mentioned that the passage of boats through this tunnel was glacially slow, and in an attempt to address this, an innovative technical solution was attempted. I think Baldrick would have classed it as a cunning plan. This involved a steam engine and a scoop wheel, which was introduced next to a single lock gate. This allowed water to be lifted up from the Halesowen side into the section of canal next to the tunnel mouth. This then would create an artificial flow of water from the west through to the east. The maps. The loaded boats would have been marshalled in the gap between the tunnel mouth and the lock gate. And then, when the water level rose, they would be gently pushed through to the east. Now, there was no reciprocal steam engine on the eastern side, but instead the water that had accumulated in the long pound between here through the tunnel and all the way to the Selly Oak stop lock would have risen by a few inches. And so any boats which wished to pass from the east through to the west, and these were mostly empty boats, were carried along by a much lesser current as the water returned back to the Halesowen side. After all, we wouldn't want to give the water to the Worcester-Birmingham Canal, would we? Well, a quick spot of mental maths tells us that over 1/3 of this lost canal lies underground, which rather limits the amount of exploration that we can do. Certainly, making an interesting YouTube video about the tunnel is going to be a bit of a challenge, but let's see what we can do. It's important that we look at this tunnel, if only because it was the 4th longest canal tunnel ever built in the UK. So it really isn't to be underestimated. But from the outset, it went through unstable geology, and This was a problem which beset the tunnel for its entire operational life. The ground that this tunnel was pushed through went through wet running sand, and this caused real problems for the architect William Underhill. That's a really good name for a tunnel maker. Anyhow, he undertook the painful construction process, but when the tunnel was operational, it was constantly beset by partial collapses. These were repaired again and again, but eventually a massive collapse happened due to mining subsidence in 1917, and it was considered uneconomic to restore the canal. So at that point, the Lapal Tunnel ceased to be a through route for commercial traffic. So the tunnel itself may have been blocked in the First World War, but the approaches remained in water for much longer. They acted as two branch canals. The end here at the Halesowen end tended to be more for leisure activity, but there was still industry on the far side at Selly Oak. So what we had, instead of a through route, it became a canal of two branches. For many years, the tunnel portal just behind me was partially bricked up to above water level to stop intrepid rowers having to go and look down this unstable tunnel for themselves. And whilst that precluded any adventurous activity from here at the west, it didn't stop some intrepid souls venturing in from the east. The eastern portal remained accessible right through into the early 1960s, and the last known explorer to go into this tunnel in any real way was a very young Edwin Fasham and his brother Andrew. Edwin and Andrew made two forays into the tunnel. The first was on a raft made of floating packing cases, and to be honest, they didn't get very far. They got in 300 yards, and then they encountered a floating lock balance beam, probably from the Selly Oak stop lock, and that stopped them going any further. But the Fashams are a pair not to be put off by obstacles, so they decided they were going to go further and got hold of a couple of canoes. And they went into the tunnel armed with the canoes and some landing boards, and they went over the top of the balance beam and they went to the first rockfall. This rockfall didn't completely obscure the tunnel, so they went over that and continued down from the western side. So they managed to cross the obstacle in their canoes, and they carried on for nearly 3/4 of a mile, nearly as far as the single air shaft, where a major roof collapse completely blocked further progress. Fortunately for us, Edwin and his brother took a number of photographs of this expedition, so even now we have got some photos from 1961 to show what the inside of this tunnel used to look like. As a teenager, I can see massive appeal in going down this abandoned canal tunnel, but I have to say, I guess the passing of the decades makes one more cautious, because to be honest, neither Edwin nor myself would chance our arm at it these days. Shortly after Edwin's expedition in from the east, the portal at the Selly Oak end was also covered over, and therefore what was left of the tunnel has been left underground undisturbed for the past 70 years or so. Now, if I can't go through the tunnel, my aim for this episode is to run over the tunnel as closely to its line as it's possible to go. A lot of it runs through the Woodgate Valley Country Park, which is quite handy because it's public open space. And where I can't, I'll simply look in from the edges or possibly fly the drone over. Now, if we look at the 1912 map, we can see that every 100 to 150 yards, the builders sank a shaft to get down to the water level so they could dig out in both ways. And of course, they dumped their spoil where they tunnelled. And my ambition for this expedition is to walk the line of the tunnel and see if any remains of these spoil heaps are still there 140 years later. I have no idea how this is going to work out, but I hope you enjoy the expedition anyhow. There's nothing like walking up over the hill that a tunnel goes under to realise just how much height that you're gaining. The line of the canal came around the back here, around the back of Lapal House and Lapal Farm, and crosses across this meadow. And as far as I can tell, probably runs just about underneath that little haystack, heading out towards the M5 just over there. Now, so far, no evidence of any of the spoil heaps, But let's crack on and see what we can find. Now, the massive earthworks associated with the construction of the M5 cutting and the housing estates around it have pretty much obliterated all traces of the construction of the Lapal Tunnel. That said, it is known that the Lapal Tunnel lies fairly close beneath the deck of the road. So to prevent any further settlement into the tunnel, when the M5 was built, concrete was poured into the tunnel from both ends, effectively making a concrete solid block all the way across from one side to the other. Well, I never seriously expected to be able to find any remains of spoil on a modern housing estate like this. But according to the maps, the line of the old Lapal Tunnel runs just underneath the bungalow behind me. And according to the 1912 map, the first of the spoil maps on this side of the M5 was just in this area. The line of the tunnel then continues on behind the camera and out just behind the old Crown Inn. Now, I can't say I'm terribly disappointed or surprised, but at least this is the first time I've managed to access one of the sites where one of the spoil mounds would have been. From here though, we're starting to head out into the Woodgate Country Park, and that's public open ground. And if there's going to be any remains of the tunnel's construction still existing in 2021, that's where we're going to find them. Well, according to my map, the next place to go is down Watery Lane. So that's where we're going to go. And about halfway down here, in a field to my right, was the next of the spoil tips. Now, I'm not going to find a spoil tip, but if you check out Google Earth, you'll see a circular area of altered coloured ground. And I'm rather suspecting that that is the old spoil tip. Hey, come up here. I found something amazing. I know I'm a sad man, and I'm going to have to ask you to forgive me. I found something quite exciting. Come this way. You know, I said I was looking for the old spoil tips where the access shafts were built, and that I saw a slightly different colour in the grass. Well, now I've fought my way up. Look at this. This is a perfectly circular pile of dirt built around the original access tunnel. They built the shaft down here, down to the level of the canal, and then they dug out in both directions. And the piles of rubbish you can see around it is the spoil that they dug out as they went downwards. Isn't that amazing? After all of this time, nearly 200 years, the spoil is still sitting here up on the surface. I've got to admit, finding even one of these waste tips visible is a real bonus, and to find it actually out in an open meadow where you can actually see it rather than fighting through the undergrowth, massive bonus. So, as far as I'm concerned, this trek over to the far side of the M5 has been well worthwhile. Well, this is proving to be massively more successful than I ever imagined when I started to plan it. You see, tucked in around the back of the children's play area, there is supposed to be on the map a pile of spoil. And if you look behind me, that is exactly what I found. This pile of spoil is significantly larger than the last one. I'll kind of go and do a bit of a tour around the edge and see if I can find a way up onto the top, or at least gauge its height. Well, this kind of passes for a path, so I guess this is what we'll take. Well, this pile of debris is a good 20 feet high. You can see from the COVID vaccination centre behind me, it's a pretty big mound of spoil and covers a fair size area. This has got to be one of the larger tunnels, not just to get down to it, but also to remove the spoil and to permanently get rid of it. All of these old access shafts would have been blocked off, so there's no danger of me falling through into the tunnel beneath. But it is absolute proof now that I am on the line of the Lapal Tunnel. It's just about 100 feet down that way. Now, these construction shafts were built about every 150 yards. So what I need to do is to walk east for about 150 yards, and with a bit of luck I can come to the next one. And I have to admit, I am now buoyed up with a bit more optimism. And according to the map, the next shaft is actually quite a significant one, because tucked out around the back of today's football pitches, the next one is marked as ventilation shaft. Now, I'm reasonably certain that the ventilation shaft has long since been blocked up for safety purposes, but I am kind of hoping that I can actually see something tangible on the ground, maybe more than just a mound of old spoil. Well, according to my rather crude drawing on a map, the air shaft should be at the back of this football pitch, probably somewhere out under this big tree. And it looks like there's a bit of an entrance, so that's where I think we'll go next. Well, the location of the old air shaft appears to be lost. Its position is pretty well defined in relation to an old field boundary in the grounds beyond, and that boundary is still there. But of the air shaft there is nothing. I found a few old period bricks and bits of worked sandstone, which could be part of its structure, but I suspect most of it will have got bulldozed down into the shaft itself, and then the whole area covered over when these playing fields were constructed. Hey ho, you can't win them all. I've struck lucky twice, and I think I'll give the dice another roll and see what we can find. So now I'm going into the woods just beyond the playing fields and see if I can find the next spoil heap. But I kind of feel I'm in the right place. I'm out beyond the football pitches, and I am on a piece of ground which does seem to slope away at the edges, but I rather have my doubts that this is a shaft top. The area is just too big. I rather suspect it's an extension of the football pitches when they were flattened out, and when they flattened the pitches out and made the park area, they probably eradicated the line on the ground. So I'll jump forward another 150 yards or so and see if I can find the next one, but I rather get the feeling that the trail is starting to go cold. Well, navigating my way across this park has been somewhat tricky, especially through the treed sections, but I do have an accurate plot laid out on the map, and I know that the tunnel is running parallel to where I am, but about 50 feet into the woodland. And at the back end of this open space there should be the construction mounds left behind for no less than 2 of the shafts. Now, my search for the first of those shafts at the far corner of the field was something of a bust. I couldn't find anything in the undergrowth, so I'm pinning my hopes on something down here at the far end. Well, the Lapal Tunnel seems to have come up trumps on its final roll of the dice. Right here at the end of the public open space, where I know the tunnel runs underneath us, there is another one of these quite distinctive mounds. It's very similar to the one that I found at the back end of the play area at the entrance to the park. Well, I am very confident that I have found a third construction mound of the Lapal Tunnel. Proof that I am standing absolutely and utterly on its course. The snag is I also know that, and from here on all the way through to California, the land is going to be sloping down and the course of the tunnel is going to be running under housing estates. So the chances of finding anything tangible like these mounds is very remote. But anyhow, to find 3 of the construction tunnels from over 200 years ago is not bad going at all. Well, as expected, the site of the final few tunnel spoil heaps have been lost under the subsequent housing development. These features were fairly small, so it comes as no great surprise really. However, finding 3 out of the original 30 isn't too bad after 250 years of industrialisation. And that brings us to the western portal of the 2-mile long Lapal Tunnel. a 9 feet wide brick tube which started in the countryside outside Halesowen and ends up here in California, a suburb of Northfield. The tunnel entrance at this end remained visible for a lot longer than the one at the west, but in the end it was covered over with rubble in 1961-1962. The best we can do these days is to try to identify its exact location, and as far as I can tell, I am standing on the spot. It's about 50 metres this way from the road and about 50 metres out from the cottages behind the camera. So, as far as I can tell, I am now standing exactly on top of the portal of the Lapal Tunnel. The old photos of the California portal show how far down the tunnel was in relation to the California Inn, which stood just behind me now. My guess is that the waterline was about 30 to 40 feet down that way. Well, apart from showing you a few evocative photographs of the old Lapal Tunnel entrance, that is it for this episode of Canal Hunter, which has taken a close look at the mighty Lapal Tunnel, the 4th longest canal tunnel ever built in the UK, and one which is completely beyond our reach these days. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this slightly whimsical exploration of the lost Lapal Tunnel. If you liked it, don't forget to click the like button. So for now, that's the end of this episode of Canal Hunter. And until next time, cheerio and happy hunting.